I think we'll go ahead and get started. We may have people coming in from the missions displays outside. This morning we're going to try and take a look at the first three chapters of Book 2 of Mere Christianity. If you read them, they're pretty challenging. So we'll try and kind of walk through and see what Lewis is trying to do in those three chapters. So remember, at the end of Book 1, Lewis believes that by pointing out the objectivity of the moral law, he thinks that he's sort of given us at least some reason to think that there's a mind behind the universe. And now at the beginning of Book 2, he wants to think about what that mind might be like, and to make the argument that the Christian understanding of God is the best way to understand the mind, capital M, behind the universe. In addition to that, he wants to ask and answer another really important question. And that question is, what's wrong with the world? Now, you can kind of see why this will be an important question, right? What Lewis is going to want to do by the time that he gets to chapter 4 is he's going to try to describe what Christian salvation looks like. And he's going to try to make the case, right, that what that salvation looks like actually is the best way of addressing what's wrong with the world. So talking about what's wrong with the world is kind of like a prelude for him talking about salvation. Okay, so in order for the Christian understanding of salvation to be credible, it actually has to address a reasonable description of what's wrong with the world. Okay, so that's what Lewis is up to. So two really important questions. What is the mind behind the universe like, and what's wrong with the world? So we'll sort of embark on those two questions. Now, at the beginning of chapter 1 of Book 2, Lewis says that Christians and atheists approach the phenomena of religion in very different ways, as you might imagine. Lewis says that, if you're an atheist, you pretty much have to think that all of humankind's religious experience, all religions, are essentially equally false. Okay, if you're an atheist, you have to take that view. So the whole religious history of mankind has been sort of one series of errors and mistakes after the next. On the other hand, Lewis says, if you're a Christian, you don't have to take that view. You can actually take the view that there can be sort of glimmers of truth in religions that God has sort of put there as a way of directing folks to Christ. This is actually a view that he got from his really good friend, J.R.R. Tolkien. He and Tolkien were colleagues at Oxford together. There's a whole long story behind that, but we don't have time to look at it. So Lewis says that one of the ways of thinking about the mind behind the universe, and one of the ways of answering the question, what's wrong with the world, comes from a view called pantheism. I'll say a little bit about it here, and then we'll kind of walk through some of its implications. Anyway, just to say this, that Lewis addresses pantheism because it was sort of a growing and popular view in his day, and actually it's still popular in our own day as well. It's present in various forms of neo-paganism, in folks who sort of believe that sort of nature itself is kind of divine. So pantheism still is actually quite a popular view. So what is it, and why does Lewis think that it's inadequate? So here's one way to think about it. I'm going to quote to you from page 36 and 37 of Mere Christianity. This is Lewis's definition of pantheism. Pantheists usually believe that God, so to speak, animates the universe as you animate your body. That the universe almost is God, so that if it did not exist, he would not exist either. And anything you find in the universe is part of God. So let's see if we can kind of flesh that out a little bit. So pantheism is the view that there is such a thing as God, but that God and the universe are essentially pretty much the same thing. The world, the universe, is a direct expression of God, such that everything in the universe somehow directly expresses the will and existence of God. And of course, in pantheism, God is impersonal. God's not personal. You can't have a personal relationship with God in pantheism because God essentially is everything. God and nature or the world are basically the same thing. So as Lewis says, just as your soul animates your body, so in pantheism, God is the soul that animates the whole of the universe. So the two things are pretty much the same. And that's what Lewis says, the problem therefore for pantheism is it's really hard to deal with the issue of good and evil because for pantheism, right, everything in the universe simply is the way it is and that's the way it's supposed to be. Because it's all a reflection or manifestation of God. Are there parts of the world that you don't like? Well, too bad. That's just the way it is. Okay? It's a direct expression of God. So Lewis says that the problem is that for pantheists, they can't really sort of talk about a real separation of good and evil because good and evil simply are the product of the way that things are. And it's all sort of an outflowing of God. Now, Lewis then says that Christianity is very different. Christianity has a very different understanding of God's relationship to the world, and it looks something like this. For Christianity, right, God and the world are distinct. God and the universe are distinct things. And so if you want to think about an analogy here, Lewis suggests one. The relationship between God and creation is very much like the relationship between an artist and what the artist has created, a painting or sculpture or a piece of music, right? So when a painter paints a painting, right, the painter is expressing something of himself in what he paints. It reflects his abilities, it reflects his sensibility, but the painting and the painter are two separate things. They're distinct. They're not the same thing. And this has a really important implication, Lewis says, and that's this. In the Christian understanding of things, the world isn't simply a direct expression of God's will. And therefore, because the world and God are two different things, it's possible for things in the world to go wrong. And for us then to begin talking about how things in the world actually are contrary to the will of God. Okay? For the Christian understanding of creation, it's possible to distinguish good and evil and to say that evil actually is something which is contrary to the will of God. God doesn't want it to be that way, and that's because God and creation are two different things. And this leads to something else. Within Christianity, right, it makes perfect sense, therefore, to talk about God both judging his creation and also eventually sort of righting all of its wrongs. And of course, this is actually the Christian hope, right? That is, as Christians, right, we believe that at some point in the future, what God's going to do is he is going to restore totally the goodness of creation. And he can do that because he is the creator. He will eventually put it right. If you're a pantheist, you cannot have that hope because your God is impersonal and because your God and the world are essentially the same thing. Your God finally is incapable of radically altering the world. If your God is the creator of the world, he can radically alter the world because he created it. So Lewis believes that the Christian understanding of God's relationship to the world offers a better answer to the question, what's wrong with the world? We'll take a look at that question in more depth in just a minute. Now, likewise, Lewis says that evil also is a problem for atheists in this sense. Lewis reflects here about his own days as an atheist. And Lewis essentially was an atheist from his early teen years up until his early 30s. So Lewis became a Christian at some point when he was 32 or 33. And he's looking back at his atheist days, and he says that, the reason why he became an atheist was he came to the view that the world was simply a cruel and unjust place. And of course, something of that view, right, has something to do with his own autobiography. So we just want to remember, right, Lewis fought in the First World War. And people who fought in the First World War tended to end up with rather negative views of the world for understandable reasons. So Lewis is reflecting back on his period as an atheist. And he says, I just had this sense, right, that the world was this awful, ugly, meaningless place, and that everything that I really cared about really just was sort of like irrelevant to that world. And he said, that's why I became an atheist. But then he began to think and ask himself this question. Well, if I think of the world as sort of an ugly and unjust place, that seems to presuppose that I have some understanding of justice, and I have some understanding of beauty, and if the world is simply an ugly and unjust place, where do those understandings or thoughts come from? And so Lewis found his atheism to kind of be inadequate. So here's another quote from Mere Christianity where he makes this point. He says, "A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What I was comparing this universe with when I called it unjust. If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it?" So in Surprised by Joy, which is Lewis's spiritual autobiography, he talks about, there was one point when he was an atheist, and he says this. He says, I was mad at the world because it was so ugly and unjust, and I was mad at God for not existing. And that kind of shows you sort of where he was. And that's why he asked this question. He says, well, gosh, if I somehow have this strong sense that the world is unjust and ugly, where does my sense that the world should be just or beautiful come from? It suggests there's something beyond. If the world were simply only meaningless, if the world were only evil, right, we would never know that. We'd have nothing to compare it to, right? And so Lewis says, well, where was all this other stuff coming from? And so this is one of the reasons why he begins his sort of path out of atheism. So that's what he's trying to do mainly in the first chapter of book 2. Let's take a quick look at chapter 2 of book 2. Now, at the beginning of chapter 2 of book 2, Lewis sort of offers a warning, and that's this. He warns against people who kind of want an overly simple understanding of the world. For this reason, Lewis says, you know what? One of the things we know, the more we learn about the world we live in, is we learn, right, that it's actually a fairly complicated place. And therefore, to sort of ask or demand a kind of simple religion is sort of unjust. And so he says in Mere Christianity, another helpful quote, he says, "Reality, in fact, is usually something you could not have guessed. This is one of the reasons why I believe in Christianity. It is a religion that you could not have guessed. If it offered just the kind of universe we'd always expected, I should feel that we were making it up. It has just that queer twist about it that real things have. The problem is not simple, and the answer is not going to be simple either." So right at the beginning of chapter 2, Lewis kind of warns us as we begin thinking about what's wrong with the world that we have to be careful that our answer isn't like too simple, because the world is a fairly complicated place. And so Lewis says this, as we look around at the world, right, we do see this interesting mixture of beauty and ugliness, of moral truth and depravity, of meaning and meaninglessness. The world seems to be sort of like both those things kind of all wrapped up in once, right? There's the beautiful view of the Grand Canyon. There's the beautiful view of the redwood forests out in California. There are all kinds of beautiful natural views. And then there are things like World War I and Dachau. And all those things, right, are all rolled together in the same world. They're all part of the same world that we live in. And so Lewis's question is, well, how do we account for that? How do we account for the fact that in the midst of what seems to be a beautiful world, there is a lot of evil and ugliness and violence and depravity? How do we account for that? And Lewis says that here's the way that Christianity accounts for that. Christianity says that the world is essentially and fundamentally good because it was made by God. Okay? Most of us are familiar with the fact, right, that at the end of the first chapter of the book of Genesis, remember, God's creating the world, right, in that 7-day period. And God, after having created things, right, looks upon what he's created and pronounces it very good. So for Christianity, right, the world is a fundamentally good place. It's not evil. Evil is not somehow like inherent in the world. And yet, right, that goodness has been somewhat spoiled because of something that God's creatures have done. And that spoiledness, right, is what we call sin. I'll say more about that in just a few minutes. So Lewis says this: the fundamental Christian picture of the world, right, is good creation made by God. That explains why we have a sense that the world is a fundamentally good place. On the other hand, right, we explain evil by talking about the good having been spoiled. And that has to do both with humans, but also with supernatural agents as well. So there's that. But the point here is this. The point here is that for Christianity, evil is parasitic on good. That is, for Christianity, in the final analysis, evil really doesn't like compete with God or exist in absolute opposition to God. Evil is always a corruption of the good. So let me give you an illustration of this. One of my favorite C.S. Lewis books is the Screwtape Letters. And it's a series of letters from a senior devil to a sort of a junior devil who's being led through the school of tempters. He's learning how to be a tempter and making lots of mistakes along the way. And in one letter, the senior devil kind of imparts a huge frustration to the junior devil. And the senior devil says, look, our fundamental frustration, the fundamental frustration of our father below, the devil, is, he says, we are incapable of actually creating anything. We can only spoil what God has made. We're incapable of actually producing or creating anything. We can only wreck, destroy, and corrupt what God has made. And then the senior devil says, that's really unfair. That's the view that Lewis is articulating in Mere Christianity. That's the historic Christian view as well. So what does this mean? It means that when we think about evil, when we think about creation being marred, we need to think about it like this. We need to think of all evil and all sin as being a kind of a rebellion against God. And so Lewis uses a metaphor that probably would have meant a great deal to folks listening to this radio broadcast. He says, here's one way to think about the Christian life. We live in enemy-occupied territory, he says. Obviously, this would have been very resonant for people thinking about the Second World War, right? Poland, France, enemy-occupied territory, right? Lewis says we live in enemy-occupied territory in the sense that, right, Satan has sort of launched a kind of civil war or rebellion against God, and we're in the midst of that territory. We're in the midst of this war. And Lewis says that's one of the reasons why being a Christian is so difficult. It's because we literally sort of inhabit or are living in kind of like a battlefield. We're in the midst of a civil war. And that's one of the reasons why the Christian life is a struggle. But, and here's a really important point, there's never any doubt as to how this war is going to end up. Because the enemy simply cannot win. You cannot carry out a successful rebellion against the Creator. Because however powerful Satan is, he is still finally and fundamentally a creature and cannot resist the Creator. And this means, Lewis says, that there's no doubt whatsoever about God's purposes triumphing. Okay? Sometimes, you'll hear people say in the midst of difficulty, kind of like the difficulty that we live in, they will talk about having read the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible, and they say, you know what? We've read the end of the story and we know how the story turns out. God wins. That's what Lewis is saying. Okay? By the time that we get to the end of the book of Revelation, right, it's actually really good news. Evil has been totally removed from the world. Creation's been totally restored. The New Jerusalem descends and everything is as God means it to be. Hallelujah. Okay, that's the idea. Okay, now let me say a little bit about human sin and human evil. What's wrong with the world, or perhaps more particularly, right, what's wrong with us? Now, this is an important question because, right, different people will answer this question in different ways. Okay? I imagine that if I sent you all out on the streets of Tallahassee with a clipboard doing a survey among people, excuse me, sir, I'm doing this little survey. What would you say is wrong with the world? I'm sure you'd get, hundreds of different answers. What's wrong with the world? Well, my mother-in-law is what's wrong with the world. What's wrong with the world? Well, the Republicans are what's wrong with the world. What's wrong with the world? Well, the Democrats are what's wrong with the world. What's wrong with the world? Well, the Florida legislature, that's what's wrong with the world. And, this would go on and on and on and on. You get all kinds of answers. Lewis says that we have to be honest and answer the question, what's wrong with the world, by saying, we're what's wrong with the world. Okay? What's wrong with the world is our hearts, our souls, turned against God. That's what's wrong with the world. And until that is fixed, nothing is going to fundamentally change. Okay, so you can see he's building now to chapter 4, where he's going to talk about the work of Christ. So let me say a quick word about this. I think we have, we've got about, I'm going to explain the whole problem of sin and evil in 5 minutes. How's that? And then we'll go outside and we'll walk across the drainage pond and maybe turn a little water into wine or something like that. Lewis says that God created human beings and also angels, spiritual creatures, with the gift of freedom. And the reason why he did this is because this is actually part of God's sort of grand plan for creation. What is that plan? What's God's ultimate purpose? What's God's ultimate aim for his creation? And that's this. God's ultimate aim, God's ultimate purpose for his creation is that both his angelic creatures and his human creatures will come to voluntarily love him. And there's a reason why that this is the case, and that's because only the love of God can actually fulfill us. That is, God doesn't want us to love him because he needs our love. Okay, really important note here, because God's the creator, right? He actually has no need of us whatsoever. Okay, we don't fill some unmet need in the life of God. God's life is totally filled, totally complete. His glory cannot be shrunk or enlarged. He will always be who he is, and that will never change. But God wishes us to love him because we were made in such a way that that's the only way that you and I can truly find fulfillment. is by loving God. Now what happens is, Lewis says, the third chapter of the book of Genesis provides us with a kind of a good way of understanding what went wrong. And I'll just quote what Lewis says from Mere Christianity. This is on page 25 of your handout, number 5. What Satan put into the heads of our remote ancestors was the idea that they could be like gods. They could set up on their own if they had created themselves, be their own masters, invent some sort of happiness for themselves outside of God, apart from God. And out of that hopeless attempt has come nearly all that we call human history: money, poverty, ambition, war, prostitution, classes, empire, slavery, the long, terrible history of man trying to find something other than God which will make him happy. And I think those are really powerful lines. Okay, so here's what Lewis says here. For Christianity, right, what's wrong with us is that we've turned away from our Creator, and we've decided that we're capable of sort of like constructing a world and finding a happiness that's completely apart from God. And Lewis says here that basically all the sort of misery of human history has been caused by that desire. Because what happens, right, is that people over and over and over are trying to find happiness and fulfillment in something other than God. That something might be money, that something might be power, that something might be success, that something might be good looks, that something might be health, that something might be a whole list of things. In effect, right, Lewis says that our problem as sinners is we're looking for happiness and fulfillment in all the wrong places. And that search for happiness leads us into disaster after disaster after disaster. And so, and now this is looking forward to chapter 4, Lewis says, something needs to happen to sort of turn our hearts and minds back to God, where we'll find the true and lasting happiness. Okay? And this is where Lewis is going to begin talking about the work of Christ. So just sort of note this, that by the end of chapter 3 of book 2, Lewis believes he's sort of given us a very convincing picture of the human situation. That our central problem is that we keep sort of looking for fulfillments in things outside of God, and it never works out. And I think maybe the way that, the way we might want to think about this, right, is think about, people who thought, right, well, I'll really be happy when I get that next promotion. Or I'll really be happy when we get this next house, or when we buy that next car, or when we get the swimming pool installed in the backyard, or when, Jimmy gets into Stanford, and it just goes sort of like on and on and on and on. And of course, the happiness never quite comes. And that's Lewis's point. Lewis says, right, that as human beings, we were created to find our fulfillment in God, and we will not ever be happy until we are reconciled with Him. Fortunately, the good news is God has done something to make all of that possible. And that's what Lewis is going to describe in chapter 4 of book 2. Now, one final note, and then we'll stop. I think the thing that we don't want to lose track of here is, I think that one of the disadvantages of being a Christian is that sometimes we get dulled to our own language, right? And we have this important phrase that we use, right? It's the word good news, right? Gospel means good news. And I think sometimes we forget why the good news is good. Okay? And so it's kind of important to be reminded of it. Okay, look, the good news is we don't have to continue to live our lives looking for happiness in the wrong places and finding continual disappointment in that and hurting our lives and the lives of others in the process. There actually is an alternative. And the alternative's been provided by God, who's actually provided us with a way back to himself. The name of that road, or the name of that path that takes us back to God, it's two words, is Jesus Christ. He is the path back to God. And what we'll do next Sunday is we'll take a look at what that path looks like and where that path takes us if we decide to follow it.